The Hudson Library and Historical Society's Author Series presents author Daniel James Brown speaking about his award-winning book, The Boys in the Boat. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on May 27, 2014. The dramatic story of 9 underdog rowers and their historic journey to the gold medal at the Berlin Olympics of 1936.
Welcome to Hudson and the Hudson Library and Historical Society. I need to remind you that the Learned Owl, our wonderful independent bookstore, is selling Mr. Brown's book this evening, both in the entryway and then later, after this program, we will have a reception for Mr. Brown in the rotunda of the library. As you know, you go out the door and sort of take a left, where we'll have refreshments and you'll be able to visit with him and have him sign your books. So try and hold your signings and conversations with him toward the end. But if you have questions, we'll do questions briefly here after he speaks. Mr. Brown told me just a few minutes ago this is the first stop on his book tour, so we should feel very honored. But if you have an inkling or a desire or would like to part with some money just for the heck of it, the library is always indeed in need of funding for bringing authors like this to our community. We are exceptionally fortunate and honored to share with Hudson, Ohio, yet another Mr. Brown. In case you are unaware, Hudson was once home to John Brown, the abolitionist. This Mr. Brown, however, to the best of my knowledge, has no familiar connection to our Hudson Browns. I will tell you he is from the west coast of the United States, so I feel exceptionally honored, and we even have a little sunshine for him, as opposed to rain. In case you are unaware of his book, it's called The Boys in the Boat, and it has gained a great deal of acclaim and notoriety and has been on the New York Times bestsellers list for many weeks. We were just discussing the fact that even Pippa Middleton has read his book and commented on it. And he has written many other books, not many, but several other books. And tonight he told me he's in negotiations for the film version of this book. So please bear with me, and I hope you will welcome Mr. Daniel James Brown to Hudson, Ohio. And remember, questions immediately after and then into the rotunda. So without further ado, Mr. Brown.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. This is, in fact, the first stop on 3 weeks of book touring all over the country. This is for the paperback edition of the book. I did a tour for the hardcover about a year ago. And you know, the first night out on that book tour, I went to Chicago and I had 3 people in attendance. So it's been a lot of fun to watch the reaction to the book grow and see such nice crowds out who are interested in it. Let me start by pointing out that this story of these 9 young Americans who went to Berlin in 1936 is not the story that first comes to mind when people think about the 36 Olympics, of course. The first thing that comes to most people's mind, understandably, is the Jesse Owens story. And with good reason. The Jesse Owens story is one of those stories that we tell and retell and keep alive because it helps remind us of some of the things that we value as a people, things like fairness and equality and level playing field and great individual achievement. I think the story of these 9 boys from the Pacific Northwest who went to that same Olympic Games is another story that's worth telling and retelling because I think it also helps remind us of some of the things that we value. And in particular, this is not like the Jesse Owens story. This is not a story of a great individual achievement, although there were great individual achievements along the way. This is really a story of a great collective team achievement. And I think it helps remind us that in our history there have been times when we've been very good at creating great teams. And I'd like to come back to that theme in a little bit. But first, let me talk a little bit about how I came to write this book. About 6 years ago, my neighbor, a lady I knew then only as Judy, came to me, to my house. We have these horrible homeowners association meetings in my neighborhood, and we get together and we argue about, you know, what color you may or may not paint your mailbox, and we get in ferocious fights over these things. And this particular year was at my house. So after the meeting, Judy came up to me, and she said that she was reading one of my earlier books to her father, and her father was in the last couple of his months of his life living under hospice care at her home. He was enjoying that book, and he wondered if I would come down and meet him. So of course I did. I think it was the very next day that I went down to Judy's house, and I met this elderly gentleman named Joe Rance. And Joe was very weak. He was on oxygen. But we sat down and we talked a little bit about that earlier book, and then he began to talk about his childhood experiences growing up during the Depression. And if you've read the book, you know he had a very, very challenging, almost heart-rending family situation to overcome when he was growing up. And then he began to talk about how he had come to row crew at the University of Washington beginning in the fall of 1933, and how that had begun to transform and redeem his life in certain ways, and how ultimately he and his crewmates had wound up rowing in Berlin in 1936 in front of Hitler and the other top Nazis against a German boat for a gold medal. And I mean, as a writer, I hadn't gone down there looking for a story, but I was just mesmerized by this story. And so I asked Joe that very first day if I could write a book about his life. And he said that he didn't want me to write a book about his life, but I could write a book about all the boys in the boat if I wanted to. And so that's what I set off to do. And you know, as Joe was talking to me that day, I noticed that quite often he would tear up, and I noticed that in particular he would tear up whenever he began to talk about those other boys in the boat. So I knew right away that there was a lot more to this than just, you know, a race in Berlin back in 1936. There was a lot of heart there, and I tried to figure out what those tears were for. At first I thought they were for the loss of his teammates, most of whom had passed away in the previous few years. But the more we talked, the more I came to understand that there was a kind of joy and pride coming through those tears, and that what he really was crying about was the sheer beauty of what they had all become that summer before, 75 years before in Berlin. That almost perfect thing that they were when they were all together as a crew. And so that was an enormous revelation to me. And I've tried to keep that spirit in mind as I wrote the book. So I went down to Judy's house that day expecting to hear a story about rowing, but I found out that it was so much more than a story about rowing. And as I went on and began to talk to the families of the other boys in the boat, I quite quickly came to understand that this was a big, epic, sweeping story about the human heart rather than just a sports story. It was a story about this one boy named Joe who had to learn to survive by trusting only himself, but then had to learn its almost polar opposite, that to get what he wanted out of life, to become part of this crew, he had to learn to depend on and trust others. It was a story about craftsmanship and grace and pride and the pursuit of an ideal, and how those values were embodied in this interesting character named George Yeoman Pocock. It was a story about a very difficult man named Al Ulbrichtson, the coach, who was obsessed with realizing an Olympic dream. It was a story about grit and determination in the face of overwhelming odds, about punishing pain, psychological devastation, and ultimate jubilation. It was a story about the American genius for defying long odds. And it was very fundamentally a story about democratic idealism come face to face with fascist cynicism. And really on that level, it was pretty starkly a story of good and evil. Now that's not to say that rowing isn't central to the book, and it is certainly the stage on which these other human dramas are played out. You know, I get emails every day from readers talking about the book. And one comment that comes up almost every day, I get an email, somebody saying something to the effect of, I almost didn't read your book because I thought it was about rowing, and really what could possibly be more boring than a book about rowing. And you know, I would have said the same thing 6 years ago. I mean, it was not be a topic I would not have picked up a book about rowing. Fortunately, most of them go on to say, wow, I was really wrong, though it turned out to be about a lot more than that. And they acknowledge that it is about more than rowing. But you know, it actually does. It also turned out that rowing was much more interesting than I would have thought it was. There's an extreme physical challenge in this sport that very few things that human beings do, I think, match rowing for the rapid output of energy that this sport requires. They say that playing 2 NBA basketball games back to back is about the equivalent amount of energy to what an Olympic rower puts out in the course of a 6-minute 2,000-meter race. So an extraordinary amount of sheer raw energy and power required. There's very few things that match rowing for the exquisite coordination and synchronization and teamwork that are required. Somebody pointed out to me once that putting 8 men or women in a rowing shell and asking them to row one of these races is like putting 8 men or women in front of 8 golf balls and asking them to hit those balls at precisely the same moment with precisely the same amount of force, directing the ball in precisely the same direction, and to do that over and over every couple of seconds, over and over and over again. It's really quite extraordinary, the skill that is involved. There's also the incredible mental toughness of rowing. Rowing out in the wind and the rain and the snow and the sleet day after day. The place I'm most familiar with up in Lake Washington in Seattle, it's darn cold out on that lake in January, believe me. And so the physical and mental toughness required to keep at it is fascinating. There's a long, colorful history and tradition associated with rowing that I didn't know about when I started this project. There's the aesthetics of the sport, and particularly back in the days I'm talking about, in the 30s, when these guys rowed in these beautiful cedar shells, these western red cedar shells, just beautiful things in and of themselves. There's an extraordinary beauty to a crew rowing perfectly out on a still lake in the morning mist in a wooden shell. It's really something to behold. And there's a great deal more drama actually in a crew race than might be obvious standing on the shore and just watching the boats go by. And I've got a passage I'd like to read to try to illustrate that in just a moment. First, though, I think it's important to understand the world in which this story took place and why it had the impact that it did. It's important to recall how very popular crew was in the 1920s and 1930s. In those days, 100,000 people would routinely show up for a rowing regatta, not just on the East Coast, but also out on the West Coast, in the Midwest, On a Saturday afternoon, 70, 80, 90,000 people might turn out for a major regatta. Regattas, important races, were broadcast sometimes live coast to coast on the radio, which was then a new medium. Prominent oarsmen would find their images on the cover of Saturday Evening Post. Coxswain's sore throat could make headlines in a newspaper. So it was a big deal. And in fact, at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, the rowing events were the second most popular venue at those games, following only the track and field events in the big Olympic stadium. So I have a passage I'd like to read to try to illustrate the kind of atmosphere and drama that surrounded these events, but I need to sort of set the scene for you. This scene takes place in the spring of 1936 in Poughkeepsie, New York. It is the big national championship race. There are thousands of boats on the river full of spectators, everything from a Navy destroyer from the Naval Academy to rowboats lining the course on the Hudson River. There's a fellow named Mike Bogle up on the railroad bridge ready to detonate a series of bombs, the number of bombs corresponding to the lane assignment of the winning boat. There are thousands of people in town for the event, thousands of people along the Palisades at Poughkeepsie. To nourish their dream of going on to the Olympics that year, these 9 boys from Washington, they need to win this race, and in particular, they need to defeat their arch rivals from Cal Berkeley. Kai Ebright, the coach at Cal, has twice before gone to the Olympics and won gold medals. He's won the 2 previous national championships. And the coach of these Washington boys, Al Ulbrichtson, is obsessed with going to the Olympics, beating Kai Ebright and going to the Olympics this year. Ulbrichtson, I should also mention, is a very dour man. He does not like to betray emotion, particularly in front of sports writers and the boys who row for him. The race gets off very late in the day because of tidal conditions. It's 6 p.m. and dusk is beginning to settle over the river. Ulbrichtson and the press contingent is watching the race unfold from an observation train that is running parallel to the river, keeping up with the boats. Ulbrichtson has told his coxswain, Bobby Mock, to row from behind, but under no circumstances to get more than 2 lengths behind. And it's a very long race. It's a 4-mile race. Coming down towards the last mile, Bobby Mock has been holding the boat for a staggering 4 lengths behind the leaders, to Ulbrichtsen's utter consternation. He cannot figure out what Mock is doing, and he's slowly becoming more and more frantic as the race approaches the last mile or so. So let me pick it up from there. Let's see. On the train, Al Ulbrichtson had all but given up. "They're too far behind," he muttered. "They're overplaying their hand. We'll be lucky to finish 3rd. Ulbrichtsen's face was ashen. It seemed to have turned entirely to stone. He'd even stopped chewing his gum. In the lane nearest to him, California had powered back out in front, rowing beautifully. With a tiring field behind them and less than a mile to go, Cal was in a commanding position to win. Kai Ebright, it seemed, had somehow outwitted him again. But if anybody had outwitted Al Ulbrichtson, it was his own coxswain, the short kid with his own Phi Beta Kappa key, and now he would show his hand. Suddenly he leaned into Don Hume's face and bellowed, "Give me 10 hard ones for Ulbrichtson." 10 long spruce oars bowed in the water 10 times. Then Mock bellowed again, "Give me 10 more for Pocock." Another 10 enormous strokes. Then a lie. "Here's California, we're on them. 10 more big ones from Mom and Dad." Very slowly the husky clipper slipped past Columbia and began to creep up on Navy in second. Someone on the train idly remarked, "Well, Washington's picking up." But a minute later, someone else called out much more urgently, "Look at Washington! Look at Washington! Here comes Washington!" On the train and on shore, all eyes shifted from the leaders to the 8 white blades barely visible out in the middle of the river. Another deep guttural roar began to rise from the crowd. It seemed impossible for Washington to close the gap. They were half a mile from the finish now, still in third place, still 2 lengths back, but they were moving, and the way they were moving compelled immediate and absolute attention. In the boat, Mock was incandescent. "Okay, now, now, now," he barked. Don Hume took the stroke up to 35, then to 36, then to 37. On the starboard side, Joe Rance fell in behind him, just as smooth as silk, and the boat began to swing. The bow began to rise out of the water. Washington slid past the middies as if the Navy boat were pinned to the water. Cal's coxswain, Grover Clark, glanced across the river, and for the first time since he'd left it behind at the starting line, he saw the Washington boat sweeping up on his stern. Stunned, he bellowed at his crew to pick it up, and Cal's rate climbed quickly to 38. Mock hollered at Hume to take it up another notch, and Washington went to 40. The rhythm of the California boat seemed to waver and then grow erratic. California and Washington careened into the last 500 yards, storming down the corridor of open water between the spectators' boats. People in rowboats were standing up now, risking a dunking to see what was happening. Some of the large excursion steamers began to list toward the center of the river as people crowded their rails. The roar of the crowd began to engulf the oarsmen. Boat whistles shrieked. On the float in front of Washington's shell house, Evander May Calamar, the crew's cook, waved a frying pan over her head, whooping and urging the boys on. In Washington's press car, pandemonium broke out. George Farnell of the Seattle Times shoved his press credentials into his mouth and began to devour them. Tom Bowles commenced beating a stranger on the back with his lucky old fedora. Royal Brougham was shouting, "Come on, Washington, come on!" Only Al Ulbrichtson remained motionless and silent, still riveted to his seat, his eyes cold gray stones locked on the white blades out in the river. Joe Williams of the World Telegram stole a glance at him and thought, "This guy has ice water in his veins." With the finish line looming ahead of him in the gathering dark, Bobby Mock screamed something inarticulate. Johnny White in the number 3 seat suddenly had the sensation that they were flying now, not rowing. Stub McMillan desperately wanted to peek, to glance over toward lane 1, where he knew California would be, but he didn't dare. In number 6, over the crowd noise, Shorty Hunt could hear someone on a radio yelling frantically. He tried to make out the words, but all he could tell was that something terribly exciting was happening. He had no idea how things stood, except that he still hadn't seen the California boat fall into his field of view. He kept his eyes locked on the back of Joe Rance's neck and pulled with his whole heart. Joe had boiled everything down to one continuous movement, one thought, the crew's old mantra running on through his mind like a river, hearing it over and over, not in his own voice, but in George Pocock's crisp Oxford accent, mind in boat, mind in boat, mind in boat. Then, in the last 200 yards, thinking itself fell away, and pain suddenly came shrieking back into the boat, descending on all of them at once, searing their legs, their arms, their shoulders, clawing at their backs, tearing at their hearts and lungs as they desperately gulped at the air. And in those last 200 yards, in an extraordinary burst of speed, rowing at 40 strokes per minute, Washington passed California. With each stroke, the boys took their rivals down by the length of another seat. By the time the two boats crossed the line in the last vestiges of twilight, a glimmer of open water showed between the stern of the Husky Clipper and the bow of the California Clipper. In the press car, the corners of Al Ulbrichtson's mouth twitched reluctantly into something vaguely resembling a smile. He resumed chewing his gum, slowly and methodically. Standing next to him, George Pocock threw back his head and howled like a banshee. Tom Bowles continued to flog the back of the fellow in front of him with his old fedora. George Farnell removed the well-masticated remains of his press credential from his mouth. In Seattle, Hazel Ulbrichtson and her son Al Jr. pounded the glass top of their coffee table until it shattered into dozens of pieces. Up on the automobile bridge, Mike Bogo had the distinct pleasure of setting off 7 bombs in rapid succession. And in the boat, the boys pumped their fists in the dark night air. For a long while, Ulbrichtson just sat there, staring into darkness as fans came rushing through the car, congratulating him and slapping him on the back. When he finally stood up, reporters crowded around him, and he said simply, "Well, they made it close. but they won. And then he elaborated, I guess that little runt knew what he was doing. Thank you. Thank you. And so from there they went on to the Olympic trials in Princeton, where they quite handily beat California and everybody else and won the right to go on to Berlin. And actually, just as a little sort of side note, about 2 hours after they won the right to go to Berlin as Team USA, Henry Penn Burke from the Pennsylvania Athletic Club came to them, and he said, well, congratulations on winning. I hope you know that you boys are going to have to pay their own way to Berlin. And nobody had ever told the Washington contingent that they would have to pay their own way, and none of these boys had 2 nickels to rub together. So, and Burke went on to say, well, Pennsylvania came in second, and they've got the money, so they'll be happy to go in your place, so it's not a problem. So that night, I mean, within minutes, phones started to ring back in Seattle, and they rang all night long, basically. And by morning, there were organizing committees had been formed, and there were hundreds of both students and just Seattle citizens out on the street corners all over Seattle selling little paper badges for 50 cents apiece. And other people were making phone calls to institutions in Seattle, like the Seattle Times. And contributions started to pour in. And within 48 hours, they raised the $5,000 they needed and wired it back to New York, and the guys were good to go. But only because the citizens of Seattle insisted that it was going to happen. And the story culminates, of course, in this extraordinary gold medal race in Berlin. And you know from the minute you pick the book up that we win this race. That's not really at issue. So if you didn't know already, I'll tell you right now. They win this gold medal race. But it's really how they won it that was quite extraordinary. And you need to understand the context. There was so much going against them that day. It was a windy, miserable day. Germany, although the U.S. team, the boys from Washington, and the British team had turned in the 2 fastest qualifying times, they were inexplicably assigned lanes 5 and 6 out in the widest part of the course where they would have to row into a very stiff headwind. Germany and Italy, the 2 fascist powers, had turned in relatively slow starting times, but they were assigned lanes 1 and 2, which were sheltered the entire length of the race course. The Germans had won the first 5 rowing events of the day leading up to the 8-oared race, which is the prestige event. But they had won gold medals in 5 consecutive events, and the mostly German crowd was in a frenzy, chanting Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland. Hitler and Goebbels and Göring and all the top Nazis were arrayed on a balcony looking out over the race course. And there's some very interesting old grainy footage of them slapping each other on the back and jumping up and down as Germany wins this series of gold medals. And then on top of everything else, Don Hume, the stroke oar, the guy in the boat who sets the rhythm for the boat, had been sick with a fever for weeks on and off. And in the couple days leading up to the gold medal race had been in bed with a high fever. And the coach Ulbrichtsen, tried to put a substitute in for him, but the boat just wouldn't go right. And so the night before the gold medal race, the other boys came to Ulbrichtsen, and very uncharacteristically, because Ulbrichtsen wasn't a man people challenged, the boys came to him and they said, Don Hume's got to be in the boat. He just has to be there. Tie him in, we'll hold him up, but he's got to be in the boat. And at the last minute, Ulbrichtsen relented and put Don Hume in the boat, even as sick as he was. But for the first half of the race especially, he was almost unconscious. I mean, it's hard to overstate how sick he was. And then, on top of all that, at the start, the American boys, because they were out in the windy part of the course, they didn't hear the start was just shouted in French. And it may have been partly that it was in French. But they either didn't hear or didn't understand the start, didn't know the race had started until they saw the boats off to one side lurch forward. So they got off to a terrible start. It came storming down out into the middle of the Longer Sea. But at 1,000 meters, halfway through the course, they were dead last, and the Italians and the German boats were running away with it on those inside sheltered lanes. And you have to read the book in order, not to find out who wins, but how they win. You have to read the book because it's really quite glorious. Now, as I say, I get emails every day from readers all over the country and actually all over the world now about the book. And there's a couple comments that come up from American readers all the time and that are kind of interesting. One is that from people from both sides of our political spectrum, often quite far to both sides of our political spectrum, are always emailing me, telling me that if the other side would just read this book, everything would just be marvelous in this country. And I find that really interesting. And the other thing that comes up all the time is I get emails particularly from men of a certain age telling me that as they finish the book, they have tears in their eyes. And so I've been trying to understand those two reactions and figure out what they have in common and what they might mean, trying to understand them. And I think what it boils down to is that a lot of people see in this story things that we lost somewhere along the way. I think there's a hankering for things that are long gone. And I think a big part of that is simply remembering a time when we were better able to work together, to build teams, and to get along. So with that in mind, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes as I move towards the conclusion here. I want to reflect on a few of the things, the qualities that I think made this team extraordinary. And some of them obvious and some of them less obvious, probably. What it was that went into making them that almost perfect thing that Joe Rance cried about in the last couple months of his life. First of all, I think was their extraordinary, and this is one of the obvious things about them, their extraordinary perseverance. If you look at the improbable stock from which this crew was put together, you can't help but be impressed by their tenacity and their toughness, both mental and physical. These were boys who grew up in mill towns and logging camps and fishing towns around western Washington. These were kids who grew strong wielding axes and pitchforks. And yet to get where they wanted to go together as a team, they had to take on and defeat boys from the Ivy League schools in the East, boys who were in many cases were very privileged, boys who had learned to row in prep schools. When these guys at Washington showed up, they didn't know one end of an oar from the other. They had to row against kids who had learned to row in prep school, kids who were in many cases, the sons of very well-heeled people, often sometimes U.S. senators. President Roosevelt had a couple of sons rowing at this time. So in the East, rowing was still somewhat a class, privileged class sort of activity, and those were the kinds of boys that these boys from Washington State had to row against. And then beyond that, when they got to the preliminaries in Berlin, they had to row against kids who in some cases were literally aristocrats, kids from Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, and then ultimately they had to take on and row against this hand-picked Nazi crew. So they were perpetual underdogs in that sense, and they were constantly persevering and going through the next barrier and taking it to the next level of competition. So that's one thing. Their perseverance, I think, was extraordinary. A second, less obvious thing is that they had a higher cause, and this is hard to understand without talking a little bit about a man named George Pocock. Just very briefly, if you haven't read the book, George Pocock was a British-born boat builder who handcrafted these beautiful cedar shells that they rode in those days. And he was an exquisite craftsman, and he was an idealist. He believed in doing things as close to ideally as possible. He was also a very good rower, and both in building boats and in teaching about rowing, he tried to teach these young men to reach for the ideal, to reach for something higher. To race to win, certainly, but to row and to race to make better men of themselves. There was a kind of spiritual quality to Pocock about endeavoring to be your best at something, in this case, rowing. And it permeated the culture of this crew, of these coaches, and of this story. Every chapter in the book starts with a quote from Pocock along those lines. I'll just read one of them. He said, "It's a great art is rowing. It's the finest art there is. It's a symphony of motion. And when you are rowing well, why, it's nearing perfection. And when you near perfection, you're touching the divine." So they had a sense of purpose, of a higher purpose. The third thing about them is that they weren't an accidental team. They were put together. They were designed as a team. Rowing is a sport that you would think that you could just put the 9 strongest men or women in a boat, and that boat would beat the boat next to it. But rowing coaches have told me over and over that it's not that simple. Rowing crews are put together by very careful mixtures of both physical types and personality types. It takes, for instance, strong, heavy men in the middle of the boat, lighter, more technically proficient men. I'm talking about men in this case. Same thing applies in women's boats, up front of the boat. It takes people of a certain kind of character to calm a crew down and keep them on keel. It takes somebody else with a different kind of temperament to act as a sort of spark plug for the crew. So, like most great rowing crews, this one was carefully designed, and it took a lot of mixing and matching to get that blend just right. And it really wasn't actually till Ulbrichtson dropped Joe Rance into the number 7 seat in the spring of 1936 that boat finally really took off. So it was carefully designed. It was thoughtfully put together. The fourth thing that I think was critical was, and hard to overstate, was the enormous amount of trust and mutual respect that these 9 young men had for one another. Trust is absolutely essential in rowing, more than in most endeavors, more than any kind of endeavor actually I can think of offhand. To get in a boat and to row with that perfect synchronicity and execute that perfectly, you have to become part of something larger than yourself. You have to become part of this organism, this single thing that the boat is. And that requires an enormous amount of mutual trust. And these boys had that to a degree that's hard to overstate. In fact, of all the crews that Pocock saw come and go over the years, he singled out this crew as the one that best exemplified mutual trust. And by the way, these guys, they trusted each other and they cared for each other on such a deep level. It's hard to overstate. When I knew the survivors of them as old men, it was so deeply touching the way they cared for each other and cared about each other and kept in constant contact 75 years after this event had happened. It was just remarkable to behold. And then the final thing that I would point out, or I would say as a hallmark of this crew, and perhaps good teams, great teams in general, was this, and it may be the least obvious thing. These were strong young men, and they were tough young men, and each of them had a good deal of ego. Rowing's a tough thing to go out for unless you're pretty confident in yourself. But each of them also had a measure of humility, and I think that was an enormous part of their success. The harsh demands of rowing, because rowing really is harsh, taught them humility. The pain and the suffering of it taught them humility. And I think that humility was the gateway through which they were able to open their hearts to one another and approach one another and build that trust that was so important. And that becomes really important to the story. When I stand back from this story, and I didn't think in these terms until I was done with the book, after I was done with the book, but when I think about this story of these 9 young men who climbed in a boat and trusted one another and did this extraordinary thing, to me they are an almost perfect metaphor for what that whole generation of Americans did. The generation for most of us were our parents, our uncles and aunts, what Tom Brokaw calls the greatest generation. That generation, they all suffered privation at the hands of the Depression. They all learned a measure of humility, and I think that that was what allowed them to build the great teams that they did, the teams that built things like the Grand Coulee Dam and survived the Depression and won World War II on two fronts. I mean, extraordinarily generous and civil people, and people with a sense of humility. So I want to close by just reading a couple of paragraphs. Near the end of the process of writing this book, I was able to go to Berlin, or actually to Grunau, the little town outside of Berlin where the race course was located and is still located. And while I was there, I was able to go up on a balcony, and the balcony where Hitler had stood and watched the races. And I just want to read about the thoughts that were going through my mind as I was there. I stood there for a long, quiet minute near where Hitler stood 75 years before, gazing out over the Langer Sea, seeing it much as he saw it. Down below me, young men were unloading a shell from a truck, singing something softly in German, and preparing for an evening row. Out on the water, a single sculler, his blades glinting, worked his way down one of the lanes towards the large Yale sign at the end of the course. Closer to me, swallows flew low over the water on silent wings, silhouetted against the declining sun, touching the water from time to time, dimpling the silver surface. Standing there, watching them, it occurred to me that when Hitler watched Joe and the boys fight their way from the rear of the field to sweep ahead of Italy and Germany 75 years ago, he saw, but did not recognize, heralds of his doom. He could not have known that one day hundreds of thousands of boys just like them, boys who shared their essential natures, decent and unassuming, not privileged or favored by anything in particular, just loyal, committed, and perseverant, would return to Germany, dressed in olive drab, hunting him down. They are almost all gone now, the legions of young men who saved the world in the years just before I was born. But that afternoon, standing on the balcony of Haus West, I was swept with gratitude for their goodness and their grace, their humility and their honor, their simple civility, and all the things they taught us before they flitted across the evening water and finally vanished into the night. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking him, and I'm going to walk through here and we'll take very brief questions.
First of all, I did have a chance to row with Pocock's.
Oh, you did?
As a freshman for this back in '75. But my question is this, is the descriptions of the rowing, especially when the swing is perfect, are so timeless. Did those come from those who were in that boat? Or because any oarsman would describe that today, should they have the opportunity to actually get all eight swinging together like that?
Yeah, a lot of those descriptions did come from directly from a couple of these guys left diaries and also wrote letters about their experiences. And some of the essence of those descriptions of the swing come from those first-hand accounts. Yeah.
If you have a hero in your book, over here please.
Oh, there you
If you have a hero in your book, it really is Don Mock, the coxswain. But the question for you, were they not offering sports scholarships in those days? Those fellows worked so hard for their tuition and so forth.
Yeah, that's correct. There were no, well, I don't know about other athletic programs, but there were no athletic scholarships for rowing, at least, at the University of Washington at all. So what they did offer was, as long as you stayed on crew, they would give you a part-time job someplace on campus. And so for most of these guys, that was the difference between staying in university or not being able to stay there. And so they were highly motivated to make crew and to stay on the crew for all kinds of reasons, but one of them was simply that was the the ticket to staying at the university.
The quotes that you have from Prokop at the start of each chapter, are those from a book that he wrote or a diary, or where did you compile those?
There were several books. There was a book that Pocock himself wrote. There's a book that his son Stan wrote. Stan also gave me access to his father's papers, and some of them are from there. One of them actually is from a note that he wrapped around an oar and sent off with one of the Washington crews to, I forget what, I think one of the Olympics, subsequent Olympics, a sort of inspirational note he wrapped around an oar and shipped off to the crew at the venue. So they were from a wide variety of sources.
Okay, so as you, well, I know you have a lot of knowledge about rowing by the time you finish the book and stuff, but I'm a rower and a coxswain too. So I was wondering, like, have you ever stepped foot into a boat and like tried rowing?
I've set foot in a boat. Does that count? I can't say that I've really rowed in any meaningful sense, no. And it was a real concern for me. The day after I met Joe and I really wanted to write this book, one of the first things that occurred to me is how you're going to write a book about a sport you don't do. And I was very fortunate in that, for one thing, the crew folks at the current crew folks at the University of Washington also got very excited when they heard I was going to do this, because this is part of the lore of their history. And so they came to me and they taught me a great deal. They did take me out in the launch with the freshmen many times, and they various both men and women from the program, both coaches and rowers, spent a lot of time with me teaching me about technique and also just talking a lot about the experience of rowing under different conditions and things like that. And then I also had a lot of rowers read the manuscript. So it was a big, long 4-year education process for me to try to get to the point where I was comfortable that I knew what I was talking about in terms of the rowing stuff.
Which begs the question, how many of you in the room have actually crewed or rowed?
Wow. Yeah, one of the things that's been interesting to me and surprising to me going around the country, when I started this project, I had no idea how many people row and how many people of all different ages row. It's been really a revelation to me. And just an enormous pleasure to me to find so many people enjoy it.
We'll get one more and then we'll go.
On the physical part of the book, my granddaughter attends the Air Force Academy. She was an all-state rower in Florida. And because of rowing, she's ranked 11th physically out of 1,400 in her class. And she's only 5'2". She's ranked 11th.
She's 5'2" and she's a rower and not a coxswain? Really? That's great.
Again, thank you for coming. I hope you'll all take a moment and pick up some brochures on the way out about our forthcoming history brochures. Please come to our future programs. Please come and enjoy the reception. We're going to have some refreshments, and we'll do a book signing where the Learned Owl will provide books.
Stopping anywhere else in Cleveland? Nothing I've heard.
I've seen signs out there. So who you might know. Joe Rance from 7. Yes, ma'am.
production facilities for this program were provided by Hudson Cable Television, your window to the community. If you have comments or questions on this or any HCTV program, please leave us an email message at hctv@hudson.oh.us or call us at 330-653-2500. We'd love to hear from you.